1945 has been 10 times worse, and we have to understand that. And I think Professor Hall's scholarship feeds an understanding of that, will enrich one if one reads that, because that's what we need to understand. And when we're talking about the kind of ideological convergence between the United States and between Nazi Germany, vis-a-vis Lebensraum and vis-a-vis the supremacist kind of manifest destiny concept that one could expand into other people's land legitimately, was in Hitler's own words, coming from the horse's mouth, as so to speak. Hitler, according to one author, which Professor Hall cites, named Paul, states he was very interested in the way the Indian population had rapidly declined due to epidemics and starvation when the United States government forced them to live on reservations. He thought the American government's forced migration of the Indians over great distances to barren reservation land was a deliberate policy of extermination. For some time, Hitler considered deporting Jews to a large reservation in the Lubin area where their numbers would be reduced through starvation and disease. So here you have Hitler, according to one biographer of Hitler, looking to the United States system of Bantustans, of reservations, of herding groups of people into kind of enclosed areas, and looking to that and saying, well, that's what I want to emulate, that's what I want to hold up as my kind of textbook example. And so Professor Hall writes, Hitler's reference to Russians as Redskins anticipated the frequent labeling of US soldiers in enemy territory of Vietnam as Indian country. So Professor Hall posits some very interesting questions like, what meanings lie embedded in this pattern of metaphor to describe the relations of power on capitalism's most extended frontiers? Why have the terms employed in conquest and colonization of North America translated so easily into the language of capitalism's most concerted military attacks on communism? One of the most ruthless of these genocidal assaults on the real or imagined red enemies of capitalism took place in Indonesia in 1965. So Professor Hall then quotes Lillian Friedberg, who wrote in her book, "The American Holocaust might be viewed as the prototype for the extermination of the Jews in Europe. At the very least, the event must be seen as a predecessor to the Nazi Holocaust," which is essentially Professor Hall's sort of sub-thesis, that you have to understand things in a grand narrative, in a broader thing. Globalization didn't start in 1990, genocide didn't start in 1933, and these legacies and precedents that have occurred throughout history need to be appreciated, and the subtleties of them need to be appreciated in order to kind of get some bigger picture, which may one day engender bigger laws, great laws that can encompass all of humanity. And so that's the end of the fourth section, and I'm now going to read the fifth section of chapter 5 of Professor Hall's book, Earth into Property, and discuss that, and then have some summarizing comments, and that'll be me for this YouTube presentation. So the fifth and final subsection of Professor Hall's chapter is entitled From the Wars on Communism to the War on Terror. And so, this is obviously a completely germane and contemporary issue to be discussing. The idea that after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the implosion of the Soviet Union, humanity had an opportunity to do something different, to have, discussions about peace in the world, about no need for war. Of course, during the Cold War, the US used this the red threat, or the evil empire, the threat of this so-called unified communist camp to basically dispossess any indigenous people of their lands and resources, to invade other countries, to send their military war profiteer corporations into countries such as the Congo, such as Indonesia, Guatemala, Argentina, and so on, and basically carrying on the Indian Wars, which they took on since 1776. And so after the Cold War, the US didn't have this imagined or real enemy. And so after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and after the end of communism, or Soviet-style communism, the US imperialists went into crisis because they had a permanent war economy. During the Cold War, they justified, huge armaments and construction of military bases and the dispossession and marginalization of certain groups of people in the world. So now I will discuss the fifth and final section of this chapter, which is entitled "From the Wars on Communism to the War on Terror." And so this is a particularly interesting and germane and pertinent issue contemporarily, as we kind of seek to interpret the global war on terror, this construct which emanated from the disputed events of 9/11, the implosion of the towers on 9/11. And so clearly after the collapse of communism and the Soviet-style communism, after the end of the Cold War, there was this potential for humanity to live in a different world, to create universal law, to embrace self-determination, which was kind of, prevented after World War II. There was all this rhetoric of decolonization, but yet you had this kind of informal empire of the United States and this informal empire of the Soviet Union stepping in and saying, no, we're going to control your resources now, Africa. We're gonna take over where the Belgians and the French and the British formal empires sort of left, and so and so Professor Hall basically discusses this in light of the information he's adduced regarding the war profiteer section of the U.S. of corporate America. The war profiteers, IG Farben was, a European conglomerate, but you had Ford, you had DuPont, you had a plethora of war profiteers, corporations, Standard Oil of New Jersey, for example, and so on. So yeah, Professor Hall summarizes again in this part, sort of concluding part of the chapter, just saying, as Edwin Black has chronicled in a great detail, the German subsidiary of the New York-based IBM company developed the data processing system used in Hitler's attempt to isolate and eliminate European Jewry. Irene DuPont was the major shareholder in General Motors. He was extremely clear about his preference for Hitler's model of capitalism over that of Roosevelt. Andrew Mellon's Aluminum Corporation of America supplied much of the light metal that built up the German Air Force. Similarly, Coke, Kodak, International Harvester, and ITT would not be excluded from the fascist business actions, and the list goes on and on. The domain of fascist business enterprise expanded with the proliferation of the Nazi puppet regimes in occupied Europe. For instance, the fascist government of Henri-Philippe Pétain in France, the Christian Phalangist regime of Francisco Franco in Spain, provided with wide latitude for transatlantic business transactions, supporting the Axis side of the Second World War. Having allowed the reader to garner an appreciation for the transatlantic war profiteering which occurred prior to 1945, he then sort of seeks to bring the reader up to date, and in doing so, initiates a discussion on how we would interpret 9/11, and that of course is 9/11 can be interpreted many ways. It can be interpreted as 19 Saudis with box cutters sort of appeared out of nowhere, emanating from caves in Afghanistan, and managed to fell these huge monstrosities of steel towers into dust with a couple of planes. Or it can be interpreted, as many have, that it was a false flag operation, that it was essentially orchestrated by elements within the US government or friends of the US government, by a group of war profiteers, essentially, just as certain similar types got together in Wall Street to initiate and the Treaty of Versailles, which indebted Germany and helped to initiate this huge conflagration we call the Second World War. Well, people get together, war profiteers get together, and they discuss things and they organize things, they conspire. Bourgeois people do conspire to control the working class, to